You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
Everyone loves to learn about pirates, of course, but the general court, like I said before, it's not just like a place for pirates. This is their way that they might interact with royal government. So it means different things to different people, I would say, for sure. I think it's also really important to think about the other side, though, of this building and what a court could mean to people.
Hello, and welcome to episode 391 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Williamsburg, Virginia served as the capital of Virginia between 1699 and 1779. During its 80 years of service as capital, Williamsburg represented the center of British authority in Virginia. This meant that the royal governor of the colony lived in Williamsburg. Indigenous, Colonial, and other delegations came to Williamsburg to negotiate treaties and trade with Virginia. And the colonial government of Virginia met in Williamsburg to pass laws, listen to court cases, and debate ideas. Now, on colonial period maps, the city of Williamsburg appears to be an arrow. On the feather end of the arrow is the College of William and Mary, and at the tip of the arrow is the Capitol building, the seat of British and later revolutionary governments in Virginia. Now, although the original Capitol building burned down, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation reconstructed the Capitol building during its early restoration period in the 1920s and 1930s. Today, the Capitol building is one of the highlights of the Foundation's Living History Museum. Now, last fall, with the help of a lot of different colleagues from around the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, my Innovation Studios colleague, Katie Schinnebeck, began researching how Virginia's colonial legislature, the House of Burgesses, conducted business in the Capitol building so that our video team could conduct a video shoot recreating its business and a lot of important historical moments, like Lord Dunmore's dissolving of the House of Burgesses in 1774 and Ellen Pendleton's 1776 resolution that permitted the Virginia delegates to the Second Continental Congress to move that the United States should declare its independence. This research was really intense, and Katie did a great job. So we thought an episode about Williamsburg's Capitol building and the details of how Virginia's House of Burgesses and its revolutionary government met was in order. So in this episode, you will join two of my Innovation Studios colleagues, Ashley Bachnight and Katie Schinnebeck, on an exploration of Colonial Williamsburg's Capitol building and the important work and events that took place within it.
During our conversation, our guest shares why the Capitol building is crucial to understanding our nation's history and what it reveals about the lives of those who were part of its stories. Katie Schinnebeck, digital projects researcher at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, joins us to discuss the importance of preserving the Capitol building and the famous legislative stories that took place there. Using her research, Katie delves into how to use documents and artifacts to uncover the Capitol's history, the significance of living history programs at historic sites, and how public memory impacts the preservation of colonial-era structures. Now, are you ready to explore the Capitol building's history and see how it shaped our nation? Let's dive into our conversation with Katie Schinnebeck. Our guest today is a digital projects researcher here at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios. She received her PhD in public history from North Carolina State University, and her research focuses on the historical memory and the American Revolution. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Katie Schinnebeck.
Thanks for having me.
So, Katie, could you start by telling us what was the Capitol building in Williamsburg and what was its significance in 18th century Virginia?
So the Capitol building was, in essence, the center of government for colonial Virginia. So because Virginia was a British colony, that made it a symbol and a physical representation of British power in Virginia. So Jamestown had actually been the first capital city of Virginia, It had been established in 1607 in what colonists called Virginia and what the people indigenous to Virginia's Tidewater region called Senecomica. So then in 1699, Virginia's capital moved from Jamestown to Williamsburg. 6 years later, they had completed building Williamsburg's first Capitol building, which then burned down in 1747. So a second Capitol building was completed in 1753, and that was the Capitol building through the early years of the American Revolution and War for Independence, up until 1779, when the capital of Virginia moved once again, this time from Williamsburg to Richmond, which is still Virginia's capital city today. Essentially, here in Williamsburg, there were two Capitol buildings. They were both on the same spot, and one just replaced the other because of a fire. So there are those two buildings, and that second building also did burn down. It burned down in 1832. So today there is a Capitol building here in Williamsburg on that very same location, but it's a recreation that Colonial Williamsburg built in the 1930s. So that's a really basic overview of what the building was and the history of the building itself. And as for what actually happened in the building, this was, as I said, the government building. So really the main functions of Virginia's royal government happened in the Capitol building. That would be the highest civil and criminal court in Virginia. The general court met there. The governor's council, so his advisors, met with him there. The governor's council met with the governor in the Capitol building. They were the upper house of the legislature, and they advised the governor. And the lower house of the legislature, the House of Burgesses, also met in the building. Then, of course, there were clerks, people who sort of did the actual work of the government, who also had offices in the building. So all of the parts of the government were meeting and operating from the colonial government building, the Capitol here in Williamsburg.
So the Capitol building was the center of Virginia's government. Could you give us a little more information about the colonial government and how it functioned? And also, did the king ultimately have full control over the government?
Right. So Virginia was a royal colony, and that means that the king was really the ultimate authority, but that doesn't mean he had ultimate control here in the colony. So I just mentioned some of the parts of government, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about how those actually worked together. So colonial Virginia did have an executive, and that was the royal governor. He was appointed by the king to really serve as his proxy in the colony. And the royal governor administered the government. He served also as the head of Virginia's military. Virginia's legislature, as I just mentioned, it had two houses. The upper house was the council, and the council was a group of 12 men who pretty much exclusively came from the colony's social elite, and they were also appointed by the king. They were kind of appointed sort of like at the king's pleasure. So he would appoint them and he could unappoint them at any time, but really he never unappointed people. So they would pretty much serve for life. And a lot of people from the same family would be on the council. So it's a very elite group of people. And then, as I said, they served as the upper house of the legislature and also as advisors to the governor. And then there was a lower house of the legislature, which was called the House of Burgesses. And each Virginia county elected 2 members to the House of Burgesses. There's some deviances from that. So the College of William and Mary, they had the opportunity to elect 1 member to the House of Burgesses, even though they weren't a county. It was a college, but they still elected 1 member. At its most basic level, though, the House of Burgesses is the group of people that passed the laws for the colony. And then the governor and council needed to approve them in order for those laws to officially become law. The House of Burgesses also levied taxes and considered petitions from people that would generally be brought by burgesses on their behalf into that body. And then there was also a court. The general court was the highest civil and criminal court in Virginia, and the governor and his council made up the judges of the general court. And that group also met in the Capitol building. So that's all of the parts of government, at least that happened in the building itself. There were also courts in every county of Virginia. And that's really where government, I wouldn't say it came to the people, but in a way, most people living in Virginia who had an interaction with government really would have that interaction with government through a county courthouse and the operations of a county court, or the operations of the sort of militia and militia musters that they would have. So that would be a more local thing. So the Capitol building is going to be somewhere that an everyday person wouldn't necessarily be interacting with the House of Burgesses. They wouldn't necessarily be interacting with the governor or the council. They might come to a court case. If they're unlucky, they might be involved in a court case at the general court at the Capitol. But that's really, the Capitol building is a fairly elite space that government is happening, and people aren't necessarily going there. They're not necessarily a part of it as much as they might be, like I said, part of a court case or electing a burgess. Burgesses, though, were elected by a pretty small group of people in the colony. You had to be a property-owning adult white man in order to vote.
So by the time of the Revolution, Virginia was a royal colony. However, many people know that Virginia was founded by a joint stock company. So how did Virginia actually become a royal colony?
This has always been really interesting to me in a very nerdy way, but it's really interesting how each of these British colonies in general, but in North America, they all were started at different times by different people and for different reasons. And so each colony ends up developing really differently for that reason. They all have different forms of government. So what I'm describing in Virginia only applies to Virginia. So Virginia initially had a charter from the king, which was essentially the king giving them permission to come and set up a colony. And he issued that, King James I issued that in 1606. So he allowed the Virginia Company, which was a joint stock company in which people invested, hoping to earn back their money with the profits that people in Virginia would make. So the king granted that charter without going really deeply into Virginia's charters. Basically, the Virginia Company struggled to operate effectively and make money. So their charter was revoked once. There was a second charter. It was revoked again. There was a third charter. It was revoked again. There was what we called the Great Charter. And then in 1624, so that's a lot of charters in not that many years. In 1624, the king just kind of fully took control of the colony, and the Virginia Company actually just dissolved in 1625. So at that point, the king assumed control of the colony, and that's how the government that I have been describing came to be developed. And this developed through, there's no written constitution or anything. There's no written form of government for Virginia. What happened is that your charter gets revoked and now the king's going to appoint somebody. And in 1619 is the first time that the House of Burgesses had met. So it's this series of precedents that have been formed here, combined with the king's authority needing to be followed, combined with adopting English norms and precedents. And that's how things developed here. But it is really interesting that we've got the Virginia Company, and, we might learn about that in school. But the Virginia Company, they're a really big part of how Virginia comes to be. But by the 1700s, and especially the time of the Revolution, this has been a royal colony for quite a long time. And so that's the trajectory on which it's developed. And the people here are loyal British subjects.
Okay, Katie, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the court. We know that the Capitol building housed the highest court in Virginia, called the General Court. So what kind of cases did they try? And could you share with us a few examples of some of these high-profile cases?
Yes. So the General Court was the highest court in Virginia, and it heard appeals of cases from the county courts, and it also tried most felony cases, so any case involving loss of life or limb as a punishment. And that did not apply for enslaved people, which those cases were still held in the county courts. There is a really high-profile case that happened at the Capitol that people talk about today, and that is the trial for Blackbeard's crew. Blackbeard, he was also known as Edward Teach, and he was an English pirate. In the early 1700s, piracy, we know Pirates of the Caribbean, and it's easy for us to be on the pirate side, but Edward Teach and his crew were really harassing trade along the North Carolina coast. And that was like a real problem for people. People are relying on reliable trade across the ocean in order to sell their goods and bring over goods. People did not feel like North Carolina's governor was doing enough to curtail Blackbeard and his crew from harassing trade. So they actually sent a note to the Virginia governor because the colonies were right next to each other. And so if Blackbeard's not going to get stopped in North Carolina, who's to say he's not going to come and start really harassing trade in Virginia too? So North Carolinians were hoping, okay, maybe we can get Virginia to come down and do something. And Governor Spotswood did. He enlisted 2 ships and he sent them down to North Carolina to apprehend Blackbeard. And there was a big battle at Ocracoke Inlet. And in this battle, Blackbeard and several of his crew died. Just as a note, apparently we call Blackbeard Blackbeard because his beard was black, but also he had this like long black beard and he would apparently braid it. And then he would sort of loop the long braids up and around his ears and they would hang down. And then Blackbeard, when he was in battles, he had a hat and he would light 2 long matchsticks and then he would stick them in his hat. Just imagine in this battle, you've got this pirate with his braids and his smoke is like emanating. So anyway, in this battle, Blackbeard dies and several of his crew died as well. Many of the crew that did not die were taken prisoner and they were shipped up to Virginia's capital to stand trial. So they spent several months in the jail here in Williamsburg. And then in 1719, they were tried by an admiralty court in Williamsburg's capital. We don't have the records from that case specifically, but it's likely that the governor himself would have presided in that court. And we do know that all but one of the 15 men who were tried were found guilty and they were sentenced to hang. The case of the one man who was found not guilty, he actually was not a pirate. He was a man who had been partying with Blackbeard's crew the night before the battle. And so he was still on their ship the next morning when the battle happened. And honestly, I feel so bad for this man because can you imagine you're just partying with some pirates and all of a sudden there's a battle happening, which one, that seems awful. And then next you're being captured and you are being shipped to a whole other colony. And now you're in jail and all you can do is wait for months to try to plead your case that you are in fact not a pirate. You're just happened to be there. Anyway, that's an aside. So he was found not guilty, which is great for him. And then 14 men were found guilty. One of those men ended up being pardoned. So 13 men who had been part of Blackbeard's crew were hanged in Williamsburg as a result of this trial. That's a really high-profile case. Everyone loves to learn about pirates, of course. But the general court, like I said before, it's not just like a place for pirates. This is their way that they might interact with royal government. So it means different things to different people, I would say, for sure. I think it's also really important to think about the other side, though, of this building and what a court could mean to people. We know that the court is one of very few ways that people could gain freedom in 18th century Virginia. I'll mention most of the records for the general court did burn in a fire. So we don't really know as much about freedom suits as we would like to and the specific cases that were brought. But there's one interesting source on general court cases, which Thomas Jefferson compiled. He sort of had an interest in the subject, and so he compiled historical examples, so even things he wasn't involved in. So because of that record, we at least have some things because the records he compiled were published in the 1830s in a book. So I was kind of reading through these and I was really struck by this one case that Thomas Jefferson himself tried. The case was called Howell v. Netherland. And in that case, Thomas Jefferson represented a man named Samuel Howell, who was an indentured servant. And then, in an interesting twist, Thomas Jefferson's mentor, George Wythe, represented Wade Netherland, who's the man who held Howell's indenture. So this was a freedom suit, but for an indentured servant brought into the court. And according to Thomas Jefferson, Howell was illegally being held in servitude until the age of 31 because his grandmother was biracial. So many of us know there was a law concerning slavery at the time, and it stated that the status of a child followed the status of the mother. Therefore, the child of an enslaved woman would be enslaved, and the child of a free woman would be free. Thomas Jefferson quickly kind of disregarded that law in terms of this case because none of the people involved were enslaved. They were free, but they were indentured servants. But he talks about another law. There's this other law, and it aimed to discourage interracial relationships by saying that if a white woman and a Black man have a child, that child would be indentured until they turned 31. So because of that law, Samuel Howell's biracial grandmother had been indentured, and then in accordance with the law, her daughter had been indentured as well. But now her son, Samuel, was being indentured, even though presumably Samuel's father was white. So Thomas Jefferson argues that this law only applies to the first biracial child and their children, but it does not apply to subsequent generations. So that's the nuts and bolts of his argument. He says some really interesting things about how people are born into a state of freedom, and that's kind of part of his reasoning why Samuel Howell should be considered free and not be held in servitude. So I think that there's a lot of interesting things going on in this case. Of course, I think people find it interesting that Thomas Jefferson was arguing on the side of freedom in this case, although we know as a great example of John Adams defending the British soldiers in the Boston Massacre case, that in this time period, your legal cases don't necessarily align with everything that you might hold to be true as a person. But this particular case, it's interesting to see how Thomas Jefferson is thinking and what legal precedents he's using in order to argue for Howell's freedom. The footnote to this is that Thomas Jefferson gave his whole case, and then George Wythe stood up to present his case, and the court is like, stop right there, you've won. So Thomas Jefferson ends up losing the case. George Wythe apparently just never even says anything. And Howell remains in indentured servitude legally, but we know there's a footnote to that story, which is that Wade Netherland put an advertisement in the newspaper within a few months saying Samuel Howell and his brother Simon had run away. And I believe that's the last we hear of Samuel Howell in the historical record.
Now, I have a question about this idea of freedom. You've mentioned the enslaved community and how they interacted with the courts differently. So could you give us some examples or share with us how the court system worked for those who were enslaved? Did any of them attempt to petition freedom, or was there another avenue they took to gain their freedom?
The courts are one way to gain freedom if you believe you are being, indentured or enslaved illegally. So that's one avenue, but you have to be able to make that argument. So that is one avenue to freedom. Again, we don't know a lot about how it's being used in the general court because those records have been lost. But in county records, there are examples of county courthouses and cases where freedom suits were being brought. So that's one avenue. One of the reasons it was so difficult for enslaved people to gain their freedom through the law in the 18th century was because of the law. In 1723, Virginia passed a law that made it illegal for enslavers to free the people that they enslaved. So that law stipulated the only way an enslaved person could gain their freedom was through a petition submitted to the governor and council, arguing that their freedom had been earned through meritorious service. So we know that less than 25 people gained their freedom through this method from the time the law was passed to the time of the American Revolution. In 1782, just as an addendum to that, a new law was passed in 1782. We had declared independence, and the war for independence was really winding down because it was post the siege of Yorktown. So this was a time when kind of government was putting into action the ideals of the American Revolution, which were about equality and freedom. And so we have this new law in Virginia that allowed enslavers to free slaves at will. It had some stipulations in it, but this was a radical departure from that 1723 law, which really restricted it. Of course, it's really interesting then to see who used that law in 1782. There was one case that we know about where a person did successfully petition for freedom, and this is the case of Matthew Ashby's family. So Matthew Ashby was a free mixed-raced man, and he was married to Anne, and they had two children, John and Mary. Anne, John, and Mary were all enslaved by a man named Samuel Spur. In order to free his family, Matthew Ashby first purchased them from Spur for 150 pounds, making him, in the eyes of the law, technically their enslaver. And on his path to freeing his wife and children, now he had technically become their enslaver, but because of that 1723 law, he couldn't free them legally. So he had to petition the governor and the council, which he did. And he petitioned them, and to argue his wife's meritorious service, he said, she's been a really good wife. We know that the governor and council did grant his petition. So Anne, John, and Mary were all freed through this means of petition. So this was one of those less than 25 examples that we know of someone being able to use the petition process successfully.
Okay, so the Williamsburg Capitol was also the site of some of Virginia's revolutionary activities. One of the most well-known events that happened in this site was the Virginia Stamp Act Resolve in 1765. Could you share with us what exactly is the Stamp Act Resolve?
Yes. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which was a tax on a variety of paper goods like legal documents, newspapers, even playing cards. We know that wasn't the first act passed by Parliament that really drove a wedge between the colonies and Britain, but it was one that prompted protests really at a whole new level. So here in Virginia, the Stamp Act had been passed, the news had gotten here, and the House of Burgesses were in session. It was the end of the session at the point that our story picks up, and only 39 Burgesses were still in town. Patrick Henry was a brand new Burgess, and he gets up and he gets a debate going about how the Burgesses should respond to the Stamp Act. And Patrick Henry's speechifying is the story here in a lot of ways. So this is not the moment of his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech, but this is another really dramatic Patrick Henry moment. There is a quote that a lot of people have heard that is attributed to this moment, and there's a couple parts to it. So apparently in his speech, Patrick Henry goes, "Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III." And he doesn't get to finish because all of the Burgesses start yelling, "Treason!" And then he picks it back up. So it's, "And George III may profit by their example." And then, very dramatic line, he goes, "If this be treason, make the most of it." So I don't think that there is evidence he said exactly that. There is one account by a Frenchman who was kind of passing through town and happened to be there and stood next to Thomas Jefferson. And like they watched this speech together. And he writes this account that Patrick Henry says Tarquin and Julius had their Brutus, Charles had his Cromwell, and then he's kind of starting to say something about King George III. And apparently people do say, like, this is treason. Are you saying treason? And he's like, no, I'm loyal. So it's not quite as dramatic as the story makes it seem. But truly, he's giving some pretty electric speeches. And eventually, the Burgesses do pass 5 resolves. So these would be the Stamp Act resolves. And they, in essence, say Virginians should not be taxed without representation. Therefore, really only Virginia's government can tax it because that's where they have representation. So apparently that night, Patrick Henry is like, great, I won. And so he leaves town. And the next day, the Burgesses meet again. And it seems like there's an effort to rescind all of the resolves, but they only can get the votes to rescind 1. So they rescind their 5th resolve. So now they've only passed 4 resolves, and it tempers it a little bit. At this point, the 4 resolves, they just say, we shouldn't be taxed without representation, but it doesn't go so far as to say, and only Virginia can tax its own colonists. So that's the story of the Stamp Act resolves. But the story here really extends beyond the Capitol building because first, the printer of the Virginia Gazette refused to print the Stamp Act resolves. He was too loyal and he was like, I'm not printing these. So they don't show up in the local newspaper. The first time they show up in print is in Newport, Rhode Island, and Newport's Newport Mercury. They print 6 resolves, even though Virginia at this point has passed officially 4 resolves. But in Newport, they're printing 6 resolves, and they're saying all 6 of these have passed in Virginia. And it seems now like Virginia has said Parliament doesn't have the right to tax Virginia, so Virginia doesn't have to obey taxes from Parliament, and anyone who says otherwise is an enemy to the colony, which is not what was passed. So Henry sort of like lost a bit of his fight in the Capitol building, but when it comes to the broader public, he sure won because that's the version of the story that Virginia passed something much more radical than it actually did. That's what people hear about and they know. And that is what inspires other people. So for example, Rhode Island passes its own resolves. They're very much inspired by Virginia's resolves. So the Virginia resolves, both the actual ones and the sort of like story of the ones that have been passed, really help to amp up the public outcry about the Stamp Act.
Katie, this is great information, and I've learned so much so far. But before we continue, let's take a moment to appreciate our episode sponsor.
On September 17, the United States celebrates Constitution Day. Constitution Day commemorates the signing of the United States Constitution on September 17, 1787, which is why on this day, the United States celebrates citizenship and what it means to be an American citizen. Here at the Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios, we're meeting with our colleagues from across the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation to prepare some great resources that'll help you celebrate and explore American citizenship. For example, our video team is preparing a short series of fun videos that explore the origin and evolution of American government and voting rights in the United States. The Bob and Marion Wilson Teacher Institute is going to host a teacher training about media literacy, as democracy in the United States has always relied on an informed citizenry. And here in Williamsburg, Virginia, Colonial Williamsburg is working on plans to host a naturalization ceremony so that we can welcome new American citizens to the United States. To learn more about the exciting resources we're preparing for Constitution Day, visit benfranklinsworld.com/civics. That's benfranklinsworld.com/civics.
So, Katie, another significant event that happened at the Capitol in the lead up to America's War for Independence was when Governor Dunmore dissolved the House of Burgesses in 1774. Could you tell us a little bit more about what happened and why this event was so significant?
So I've been doing a lot of researching and thinking about this event recently. So in May of 1774, so this is about a decade after the Stamp Act resolves, the House of Burgesses was in session when they got word of the Boston Port Bill. So the Boston Port Bill was one of the coercive acts passed by Parliament. it punished the town of Boston for the Boston Tea Party by closing Boston's port, which is a big deal because that's how you get supplies and how you send things out to make money. So this was going to really, really hurt the economy of Boston. Virginians decided that they have a show of support for the town of Boston. So Thomas Jefferson, he later wrote about this in his autobiography. So he says that a few of us young Burgesses get together. So it's Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, and 4 or 5 additional Burgesses. They got together, and interestingly, they met in the council chamber in the Capitol building, because the council chamber had what he calls a library, but is probably some books that were a little bit more legalistic in nature. But they consulted the library to come up with a precedent for something that they could write. So they end up writing a proposal to make June 1st. June 1st was the day that the Boston Port Bill would go into effect. They write something that would make June 1st a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, which sounds like a very solemn thing. And then they ask Robert Carter Nicholas, who is known to be a very religious, very kind of serious guy, to bring this forward the next day in the House of Burgesses. So Robert Carter Nicholas does, and this passes. Sounds very solemn. It is. It would mean that June 1st would be a day they would have a religious ceremony and they would fast until nightfall and things like that. But the actual text of this, it says, and Parliament's policies will bring about our ruin. The actual language very much is condemning Parliament for passing the Boston Port Bill. At this point, the Burgesses have passed this. It's late May. And passing something like this is pretty embarrassing for the royal governor. It's going to force him to have to do something, basically, because the Burgesses can't go around passing radical things without the governor doing anything about it. So he consulted with the council, and they decided together that they should dissolve the House of Burgesses. He ends their session. And this is important, actually, because I didn't mention this earlier, but part of the give and take of royal power here in Virginia is that the royal governor, he calls sessions of the House of Burgesses in. So he decides when they're going to happen. And actually, years and years could go by, and the governor could just never call for an election and never call for a session of Burgesses. So technically, it's up to him when they start and when they end. But Burgesses have their own kind of power because they make the laws. So if you don't call for Burgesses, you don't get laws. Burgesses could also do things like set an expiration date for a bill. So at this particular time, the fee bill had just expired. And the fee bill was the bill that really kept the courts open. It set the fees. Officers of the court would collect the fees of these amounts because of this bill. So the fee bill has just expired, which means that people can't really get paid to do their jobs in the court. So the Burgesses need to pass a new fee bill, and they haven't done it yet. They're in session. They've passed the day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer. There's no new fee bill, and the governor dissolves them. So he calls them all up into the council chamber. He tells them you've been dissolved, and they all have to go home. And the courts actually close because there's no fee bill. So this is kind of power that they have, because if the governor wants the courts to reopen, he's got to call the Burgesses back into session. It's a way that there's kind of leverage between the governor and the House of Burgesses. But if we return to our story, that's some of the politicking that's going on behind the scenes. But this is part of a larger revolutionary story, too. So the governor dissolves the House of Burgesses. And in truth, they did have some more things that they were going to pass, some more like radical stuff. At least according to Richard Henry Lee, he wrote it in a letter to his friend. He was like, and I was going to propose these things, and this is what I was going to propose. So now they can't pass that stuff in the House of Burgesses, but instead they just head over to the Raleigh Tavern the next day, and a bunch of them get together and they sign something called the Association. The association said that they were going to do a limited boycott of British goods. So they're going to boycott certain goods from Great Britain. It once again asserted their right not to be taxed without representation. And it also instructed Virginia's Committee of Correspondence, which would correspond with other colonies, to recommend a meeting of representatives from each colony. They weren't the first and only people to be sort of calling for something like this, but Virginia's Committee of Correspondence did, in fact, kind of do this and helped usher in what would become the Continental Congress. So the dissolving of the House of Burgesses was important, partly because it's kind of marked this escalation here in Virginia, moving us toward creating a government really independent from Great Britain's government. You know, we have these extra legal bodies now. We're creating the association. They had done this before too, but now the association is being created by their former burgesses. They're not official burgesses. And then very soon afterward, we have the first Virginia Convention, which is the first time people are meeting in an official capacity, but not under the royal government. So it's helping really move us toward independence in a lot of ways, although, of course, the people at that moment weren't knowingly doing that.
Now, there's another significant event that was very important for this site, and it was the signing of Pendleton's Resolution in 1776, which actually helped usher forth the Declaration of Independence. What exactly was Pendleton's Resolution, and how did it come to be?
This event also happened at the Capitol, but it didn't involve the House of Burgesses. I just talked about the first Virginia Convention. This involved the fifth Virginia Convention, which at this point was meeting at the Capitol and really at this point in time replaced the House of Burgesses as the official legal body for Virginia. So in May of 1776, the Fifth Virginia Convention was meeting at the Capitol building, and the Second Continental Congress was meeting at the same time in Philadelphia. They kind of wanted to declare independence, but they were like, how do we know that we can do this? We need to have permission almost. So they were kind of like, Virginia, do we have permission? So the Fifth Virginia Convention was like, well, should we recommend that we declare independence or should we declare it? Like, how does this work? There were a lot of debates. You will be shocked to hear that Patrick Henry was one of the main people. So Patrick Henry was like, we need to declare independence. He gave these big speeches, and apparently people were mostly on board with passing a resolution saying that we were independent, or at least telling the Continental Congress to declare independence. But there was one guy, Robert Carter Nicholas, the same guy who brought the Day of Fasting, Humiliation, and Prayer to the floor in 74. Robert Carter Nicholas was like, yo, I'm worried. Like, y'all gotta stop for a second, because are we ready to be independent? Are we prepared for this? I don't think we are. Can we defend ourselves? He was trying to be cautious. And so he got up and he said, we should be considering maybe not doing this. And people got kind of mad at him. Eventually, in the scope of everything, the president of the convention, Edmund Pendleton, wrote a kind of compromise resolution, and that's what ended up passing. So it was a unanimous vote in favor, and the compromise resolution basically just said, we instruct our delegates to the Second Continental Congress to propose that body declare independence. So lots of steps still getting us there, but it was this step that allowed Richard Henry Lee in the Second Continental Congress went and proposed that that body declare independence. And then also on another note, that same resolution, Pendleton's resolution in Virginia, it also proposed or said that there should be a committee to start writing a Virginia Declaration of Rights and also to write Virginia's Constitution. Pendleton's resolution prompted all of those things. So a big deal for our country and also just for Virginia's history as well.
Katie, you were recently a part of a B-roll shoot done by the Innovation Studios to capture recreated moments of 1774, the dissolving of the House of Burgesses, and the 1776 vote of Pendleton's resolution. What was this B-roll shoot and what will it be used for?
So this was a really fun project. Our executive producer here at Innovation Studios realized that the last time any video was taken representing Burgess's meeting at the Capitol was from, I want to say, the 1950s. So she set us on this path to getting staff together to get both photography and B-roll, so kind of video without sound, of Burgess's in the Capitol. We decided to recreate the 74 and 76 events because their 250th anniversaries were coming up. And so we knew that we would want specific shots to be able to represent those moments in time. But then we also wanted to find ways to get shots that we could use to just represent Burgess's in the building, because that we can use forever. So we have used some of that already. We put out videos about the dissolving of the House of Burgesses in 74, and we used some of the B-roll for that. We put out a video about the history of the Capitol and used some for that. And we know that this is something that we're just going to be able to continue using for years and years to come, and just have a modern and hopefully accurate representation, not just of those events, but what does it look like for people to fill that room and to interact with each other and to be in a formal space of being Burgesses.
Oh, wow. This B-roll shoot sounds like a massive undertaking. And I have a question about the research process. Could you share with us how you approach researching for this project and how you apply historical sources to create scenes for this B-roll?
Yes, so this was very fun and also really challenging. First, in my research, I did what historians typically do, which is I just look for all of the accounts of the time period of people talking about what happened. That was where I started. I wanted to understand all of the politics. I wanted to understand what was the backstory, who was kind of saying what about it. So I wanted to know everything I could about just what happened. But this ended up being really, really different from the kind of research that historians often do, because historians are often trying to write about sweeping moments or movements, and they're not always trying to find the nitty-gritty details. I mean, we love arguing about those too, but a good example is that I tried to look at books that would just mention the dissolving of the House of Burgesses in 1774 and just see like what sources were they using, what do they say about it. And because it's like a paragraph maybe in a chapter, they're not looking at every single detail. So I had to start there where I was like, okay, I've got to find the details. I tried to find out who was there, look through their letters. What are they saying around the time? Can I find anything? But what's the most challenging about a shoot like this is that I'm not just trying to find out the behind the scenes, because I'm trying to research for a visual story. And so we have to ask questions that a lot of academic historians don't have to think about, like what was everybody wearing? Who sat where? Who was actually there that day? Did they wear hats inside? What kind of props might they have had with them? When was the latest newspaper printed and published? What was the weather that day? That was a fun one. And a really good example of this was the mace. So there's a formal mace, and it was a symbol of royal authority and the fact that the Burgesses were in session. So the mace usually gets put on the table when the House of Burgesses was in session. So you find out, okay, there's a mace, it goes on the table. Well, someone mentioned to me that they thought that when the House of Burgesses went into a committee of the whole, that they would have covered the mace. So I was like, well, I got to figure out if this is true. The kinds of things that you do in order to find out about the mace, because all of these questions are not things that normal people write about in their diaries. I first found every reference that I could to the mace in the journal of the House of Burgesses. But of course, they mention the mace sometimes. Usually it's to say that at the beginning of the session, they moved it from under the table to the top of the table. So that's something. I'm like, okay, the mace sometimes is under the table. then I'm not getting an answer to the question that I have. So I started looking at Parliament, because the House of Burgesses copies a lot of Parliament's procedures, to see what Parliament was doing with the mace. So I was looking for references to the mace in diaries of members of Parliament, their sort of legislative diaries. Eventually, I found a book by the Sergeant at Arms, kind of like a mace bearer from modern day Parliament, about the history of the mace. So I read the book about the history of the mace. I was trying to really dig into as many places I could to try to understand, okay, I can't find an answer about where exactly the mace was here, but can I extrapolate from other sources? Also, sources that are similarly not really going to tell me exactly where the mace probably is. So it was a lot of inferences. And then in the end, I determined probably the mace would have been under the table while the House was in committee of the whole, which it was during the debates over Pendleton's resolution. But then we are using a historical mace in the B-roll shoot. Very carefully, we were using it. And so, of course, I emailed the curator and I was like, well, clearly we're not putting the mace on the floor. He was like, no, we're not putting the mace on the floor. It's funny because I did all this research into the mace. And then, yes, we knew, like, take the mace off the table and put it somewhere safe. But, that's another thing about doing research for B-roll, is that you have to think about the visual story. So I did a lot of research on where does the Sergeant at Arms stand, which was impossible. I know he probably stood in a certain place, but it was really hard to pin down the source for it. But we put the camera in that exact spot. So it doesn't actually end up mattering. It matters that I know where he is, but because of the way you shoot things in film, sometimes you sink a day of research into something and then you realize that it actually wasn't needed for film, because we can use movie magic for a lot of things. So that's something that I'm getting used to in my role, because I work so much with the video crew that I have to think, when I'm thinking of my research questions, not just in terms of, okay, where does the Sergeant at Arms stand or where does the mace go, but how are they filming this? Because I might not need to know the answer to that. If I can tell them, you just have to make sure to not include this spot in this shot that you do, because we don't know the answers to some of these things. So that's the long-winded answer to how the research went. It's really, really fascinating to get to do this kind of research because I love that kind of stuff. I was telling Liz that I sometimes feel like I'm like a dog with a bone when I get to some of these things, where it was like, I can't stop until I know everything about the mace. I won't stop until I've exhausted every avenue. So it's a lot of fun to get to do those kinds of research projects.
This research is really important, and it's also a reminder that the way we research a topic is just as important as the content itself. So now it's time for a fun segment of the show where we ask a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone would have acted differently. Katie, what do you think would have happened if Governor Dunmore hadn't dissolved the House of Burgesses in 1774?
I've been thinking a lot about this question because I said before in my long-winded answer about the machinations of the dissolving of the House of Burgesses that Richard Henry Lee wrote in a letter that he was going to bring some resolves to the House of Burgesses, but they got dissolved and he couldn't do it. If you look at the text of what he was going to bring, it was very similar to what ended up in the association. It was things like the right to not be taxed without representation and the instruction about reaching out to meet with representatives from other colonies. So it's really interesting because I feel like the House of Burgesses being dissolved really is one of those points that kind of helps launch Virginia further into rebellion. But I am so curious to know, if the House had not been dissolved, would it still have just happened anyway? Like, what exactly did the House of Burgesses being dissolved do to further revolution in Virginia? So we'll never really know. Would it actually have not done that much? It's also interesting because Thomas Jefferson, in his autobiography, when he's talking about this, he says, and then the governor dissolved us as usual. So I'm so curious about sort of the level of true anger at this, or is it just something that feels significant because of how the subsequent events happened? So I'm going to say, if I have to give you a straight answer, I feel like if the House of Burgesses was never dissolved in 1774, I think the revolution still would have developed along much the same pathway. Maybe one thing is, I talked about the courts and how the courts shut down. And so it could be that there was an instability caused by that may have not happened. And so maybe things would have been actually more stable. And maybe that's one of the significant things that happened because of the dissolving of the House of Burgesses. I think it was an important event, but at the same time, I'm curious to know whether it truly sparked this movement toward revolution, or whether that was already a spark that was lit, and the dissolving of the House of Burgesses just kind of ushered it a little bit and added another reason for people to be mad at Governor Dunmore.
Katie, we've learned a lot about the Capitol building in Williamsburg today. How can people visit the site either in person or online to learn more?
You can learn more about the Capitol building in a lot of different ways. So you can come in person and visit the recreated Capitol building. That's a recreation of the first Capitol building that I mentioned, the one built in the early 1700s. That building is open for tours every day. You can go and take a tour of it with your Colonial Williamsburg ticket. You can also take a virtual tour online. And on that virtual tour, you can also toggle and see how that second Capitol building would have looked. There are ways that you could kind of switch between views, which is really interesting. And that one is a kind of 3D tour that you can take of the building to learn more about it and see what it looks like. You can also read our webpage about it. We have an updated webpage that talks more about the history of the building and some of the things that have happened there. And if anyone has listened to this far already, they're kind of an expert on the Capitol building themselves. But we did release a video a few months ago on Colonial Williamsburg's YouTube channel, and it's 5 things to know about the Capitol. So, like I said, if you've listened to this, then you know the 5 things, but it's kind of fun to watch and be able to see them a little bit more visually. So those are some of the main ways that people can learn more about it.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Yeah, so because I work a lot with our video team here, keeping up with Colonial Williamsburg's YouTube channel is a great way to just keep up with the stuff that I'm doing and learning about myself. And people are welcome to email me. We will link my email address in the show notes, I'm sure, because it's very long. It is kschinabec@cwf.org. Like I said, we can link to that one in the show notes because it's hard to find, but I welcome emails from anybody who's just curious to know more.
Thank you so much, Katie. This has truly been a pleasure, and we've learned so much today. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
Katie's insight into the Capitol building, the intricacies of colonial government, and the poignant stories of the people who lived through these times have been truly enlightening. As we reflect on the narratives Katie shared, it's essential to remember the complexity and depth of our history. The Capitol building wasn't just a government hub, it was a symbol of power, a place of justice and injustice, and a site of revolutionary fervor. The stories of freedom suits, the dramatic trials, and the legislative battles highlight the struggle and resilience of those who sought justice and change. History is not just about buildings and dates. It's about people and their stories. By exploring these stories, we gain a deeper understanding of our past and its impact on our present. Katie's work helps us connect with these narratives, making history more relatable and inclusive.
Thank you, Ashley. As a reminder, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation offers tours of the Capitol building nearly every day of the year. So when you come to visit Colonial Williamsburg, join us for a tour. And also let me know that you're coming to town. You'll find more information about Katie, the videos the Innovation Studios team has created from its B-roll shoot, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/391. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from my colleagues at Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios: Jordan Hammond, Ashley Bachnight, Derek Litvak, Katie Schönebeck, and Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, we dove into the details of how the colonial government of Virginia worked. So what other details would you like us to dive into about everyday life in early America? Let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.